Hello and a very warm welcome to this mini course on minimal disturbance gardening. This is going to be focusing on sharing with you the introduction, the context of where it comes from, and the 5 approaches as well as the 2 attitudes of minimal disturbance gardening. This only really has one goal. It's about growing food sustainably and making that as accessible and approachable to as many gardeners as possible so they can nourish their families with really good, honest food. Minimal disturbance gardening is a balanced and practical growing approach that equally prioritises the production of nutritious food as well as long-term total garden health. Any soil disturbance that is done is strategic, thoughtful, and it takes into account multiple points. The minimal aspect of minimal disturbance gardening takes into account that depending on what stage you're at and also your context, there's different variations of minimal, and minimal is far more achievable than no, and it's down to you to kind of think about what is minimal in your context, not anyone else. The fact is, nobody knows your garden, your situation, your challenges, your goals as well as you do, and also people following the exact same gardening method can experience very different results. Gardening is not black and white. It's not no dig versus double dig. I think it's very much about in the grey. I would definitely lean in the dark grey area, leaning towards no dig, but with certain challenges that I face, I need to be flexible about it. It's also important to remember that different soils have very different needs, and a lot of people experience just putting on a layer of compost on top of their soil. It just doesn't work. Sometimes you need to have a little bit of drastic action of incorporating that organic matter, especially if you don't have access to lots of beautiful compost, to mix that in the first year so you set yourself up for long-term success. So where I am, my climate is very wet. Wet soils are very susceptible to compaction. I get around 1300 mil of rain here in this garden annually, and that is around 50% more than the nicer growing areas of the UK like Kent, Hereford and Somerset. So that is a lot more rain that I'm having to deal with, and so I sometimes just need to adjust as suits. With really wet climates or even really dry climates, the best thing that you can do is add a lot of organic matter to the soil. But that requires compost, or it requires material that can break down into organic matter. And I think one of the most important things to recognise is that minimal disturbance gardening understands that either if you're buying in compost, that for the vast majority of people is really expensive, or if you're making your own compost, especially if you're starting out, you've got a bit of a time delay where you can't always access that compost. And sometimes there's going to be times where you might be really good on creating your own homemade compost, and then there's a year where something doesn't happen, and that's life. We are gardening, we're working with the elements. It can't be perfect. Nature is imperfectly perfect. And so we are going to come up against challenges, for example, pest and disease issues, cost issues, relating to budget, and challenges like maybe not having enough fertility for a growing season. And so we just have to open ourselves up to being able to work around that as best as possible. Therefore, a core factor of minimal disturbance gardening is being able to open up gardeners to a whole range of different growing techniques outside of, say, no dig. So some examples would be trench composting or cover cropping that you kind of incorporate into the soil, or even broad forking, but I'll go into that in a little bit. Minimal disturbance gardening is also very much angled towards a journey of self-sufficiency. And one of the core elements about self-sufficiency, of course, is cost, but it's also about problem solving and being able to think outside of the box. Being self-sufficient means you have to be reactive and agile and experimental and curious, and the only way to do that is to throw away the rule book and instead follow a set of principles that you can adapt and shape around your specific context. If you're confined to too many rules, what that does is it snuffs out the creativity element for me as a gardener, I think this is shared with many other gardeners, there are multiple considerations or multiple different goals that we have from our garden. And if we're only focused on one aspect and everything has to fit around that one thing, what it does is that it kind of devalues all of the other considerations and all of the other goals, and you kind of get stuck. Whereas what really we should do if we feel stuck is see that as an opportunity to just take a bit of a step back, look at the whole context, and then find the best approach to suit that, trying to tick as many boxes as possible rather than the one big golden box and forgetting about everything else underneath. I know that I'm always going to be very close to no dig, but I'm not going to be exclusively no dig, and I'm not just talking about using a fork to help with harvesting some potatoes. There's some occasions where I do think some disruption or disturbance is necessary, but disturbance is a part of nature. We'll go into that in a little bit. A big thing for me is that minimal disturbance gardening advocates for no guilt gardening. What really shocked me in a recent post that I did, someone commented saying guilt comes with the territory of gardening. And I just thought, like, how sad is that? We shouldn't feel guilty about growing food. What I always say to people when people get so caught up in this versus that, I just say, look, if you're growing your own food, it is miles better, no matter what method you're using. You know, maybe I'm not keen on the chemical side, but if you're just double digging versus no digging, that is miles better than going to a supermarket and relying on mass-produced monoculture crops that have been flown in or shipped in or whatever. The fact that there's such heated arguments about how someone chooses to grow their own food is, quite frankly, ridiculous. I will never be an advocate of double dig gardening, but if that is what someone chooses to do, and many people really enjoy the process of digging, then I'm like, you know what, that is fine. All power to you. It is your garden. It's down to you to know what you enjoy doing. And part of it is the enjoyment of gardening. Why should you feel guilty about, you know, digging or forking over soil if you actually really enjoy doing that? And it all comes from context. It all comes from understanding that there's positives and negatives behind every approach. But we need to really stop gatekeeping, and that's what I've tried to do as much as possible with minimal disturbance gardening, because minimal disturbance gardening has that goal of minimal disturbance, but allowing it to be flexible with how that is perceived. So there's no chance for this to be taken into an ideology or for like dogma to come out of it. And that's what I've tried to do with minimal disturbance gardening, is with the principles. It's not a set of rules, it's a set of principles, but they're principles that kind of like a nice guideline to aim for. And so no matter what happens or no matter what you do, you never need to feel guilty about it. And I was shocked by how many people have resonated with that message. What's also really important to recognise is that minimal disturbance gardening and most of the conversations around gardening are very much centred around the growing of annuals. Because if you're growing a perennial like this lemon verbena, you know, I dig a hole, stick it in, and it just stays there, and that's fine. But what we have to understand is that annuals in nature, we almost always only find annuals in nature in areas of disturbed ground. There have been comments saying that nature doesn't dig itself up, which is why badgers roost in trees and moles are ruminant animals. But what does happen is, say a tree falls over, you've got that bare ground. Nature doesn't like bare ground. Bare ground is an invitation for erosion. And so what happens is that all of the annuals quickly grow and they protect the ground. And the reason why they grow is because when you've had disturbance, it kills off a lot of the microbes, especially the bacteria and also some of the fungi, and that releases a lot of plant available nutrients. And annuals are very hungry because of their fast growth, and so that's what helps them create that environment for them to grow really quickly and protect the soil. And then it goes into a process of succession where it turns from annuals into biennials, and then you get your short-lived perennials, and then if completely left, it's probably just going to turn back into a forest. When we're talking about annual growing, we don't need to worry about forests. We don't need fungally dominated soils. There's this massive obsession with creating a fungally dominated soil in an annual garden. Again, I do understand some of the benefits, and I've seen amazing results from no-dig gardens, but I've also seen some really subpar results. And so using the idea of permaculture, which is looking at different patterns in nature and using those patterns to help design systems, to me, it makes complete sense and it's totally acceptable to encourage a little bit of disturbance, because you are creating that naturally bacterially dominated soil, which is what annuals thrive in. And it's really as simple as that. One of the benefits of no dig is if you don't disturb the soil, you don't get that flush of weeds. But that is, to me, telling me something. That flush of weeds happens because suddenly there's a load more plants available, nutrients, there's disturbance, it's an environment where annuals want to grow. And so I then ask myself a question, is that maybe the best time to sow annual crops, and then fight the weeds? And maybe you're okay fighting weeds, maybe you don't want to fight weeds, and again, that is your choice. There is no rules, there's just your choice, and you do what you do best. And that's all I'm wishing for, is that gardening just becomes this thing where everyone has fun, everyone can do what they want to do. And I really was not expecting to have to talk about things like this, but after I did the Danger of No Dig video and seeing how many people resonated with it, you know, it's got a 98.9% like ratio, and it's been like the second most commented on video. Just go have a look at the comments. I realised, okay, fine, I don't really feel like I need to talk about this, but at the same time, I feel that there is a great need to talk about it, and kind of just bring the fun back into gardening, you know. And I think one thing I could definitely do better is share more of the failures, because when you're looking at YouTube videos on how to grow something, it's always going to like show you it in its prime and this is how you do it, and sometimes it doesn't always work out that way. So yeah, that's a little pledge from my side, just to show that, you know, it isn't always perfect. Nature is perfectly imperfect, and so if a garden is imperfect, I don't know, that's fine. Interestingly, there have been some comments saying that I've been overthinking things, but they've been coming from sources that feel highly threatened by any slight challenge towards their ideology. And I don't have time for that. I'll repeat myself again. All I'm trying to do is make gardening as accessible and as approachable to as many people as possible so they can grow food and help the environment. I'm going to be sharing the principles now. These aren't rules. These are kind of goals or targets to aim for, and if you do a little bit of everything, or at least understand the importance of it, it will help with your decision making and help create a little bit more balance. This has very much been designed using different parts of permaculture, particularly the three ethics of permaculture, of people care, earth care and fair share. And so I'm hoping that the fair share side of this is creating free content like it, but also the people care comes under the equal priority of growing nutritious food, and the earth care is whilst ensuring garden health. Not just soil centric, but everything above ground as well. Entire ecosystem garden health, which I'll be covering very soon. There is to be absolutely no gatekeeping about minimal disturbance gardening. I think it's impossible because of keeping all the principles kind of nice and free and flowing. It's the same with permaculture, and the principles are just a curation of different thoughts, concepts, techniques, methods, approaches that I've cherry-picked that I think all fit nicely together, can all work with one another, and are hopefully nice and easy to follow. The first principle is to assess before action. When you're undertaking garden tasks and you come to a point where some disturbance might be required, you look at all of the options on the table and you choose the one which makes best sense in terms of is most beneficial and can tick as many boxes as you feasibly can. For example, if you found that a couple of your raised beds are quite compacted at the start of the growing season, obviously like a nice long-term thing to do would just be mulch that with a bunch of compost, but it's the start of the growing season. And so you kind of take a step back, and the next phase of minimality would be either adding something like soil microbes through Jadam microbial solution, or maybe you don't have time for that, or it's not warm enough to make that. So then the next line of minimality is to use a broad fork to remediate that, reduce that compaction, and you can get straight into planting and sowing, and away you go. One of the best examples is that there are usually different stages of minimal depending on the stage of creating a garden. If you're just starting out a garden, like we did for the Wi-Fi garden here in our growing project, what we actually did was we topped off all of the turf and we got compost and mulch and we forked it into the top 10-15 centimeters and planted straight into it, and we had absolutely amazing results. I didn't have loads of cardboard, and also I didn't have as much compost as I wanted to create a nice kind of deep mulch of like maybe 3-4 inches on top to plant into. I only had enough of maybe 1 to 2 inches, so I thought actually let's just incorporate that and plant into it, and we had absolutely fantastic results out of the gate. Yes, it was more effort, but I really enjoyed that effort. I kind of like a bit of physical work, and it might have taken more time, but in certain situations you might have more time than budget, and so that was one example of kind of causing minimal disturbance that is now turned into a majoritively a no-dig setup, where occasionally in the future we might broad fork it if there is compaction, but apart from that I see no other reason why we'd need to go in and make drastic changes. Another example is you might have an allotment, or you might be setting up a garden and you want to open up a space at a time. So you could start making your own compost that you could access in like a few months' time, or you could do something like trench composting, where you get that first raised bed, or you get your first in-ground bed, you dig a trench, you pack it with loads of veg scraps, cover it back over, and then you plant on top. That all breaks down and incorporates, and then as you harvest things, or you might want to lightly fork it to turn it in at the end of the season, you've added a huge amount of fertility, of organic matter, of carbon into that soil, and then moving forward you can treat it like a no-dig setup. Now with more established beds, minimal disturbance will probably return back to broad forking if the soil is really compacted and you're really struggling to either get your hand into the soil, or rain is not actually going into the soil, it's just washing off it or puddling on the surface. You don't want that. So what you could do is look at mulching for like a more long-term solution. You could look at broad forking and then mulching. You could look at just adding a load of compost and covering it. There's multiple different factors. You may find that you don't quite have enough compost as you want. Most of the beds are mulched, but for example in a polytunnel you'd be growing really, really hungry crops like cucumbers and tomatoes. And so what you do instead around 2 months before transplanting is that you just dig a hole where you're going to be planting out a tomato, and you put in a load of veg scraps and other types of amendments, cover it over, put a stick to mark, and then a couple of months later you plant a tomato plant on top instead of having to buy in compost. And that is also a really great method if you're growing things like winter squash outside. You don't have to mulch the whole bed with compost. That could be mulch with something else like seaweed, or you could do light layers of chop and drop if you suffer from slug damage. You don't want too thick of a organic material mulch, but where you do plant that plant, you bury in a lot of fertility in that one specific spot or location. Two things that I did at the start of this season in the old garden was that I didn't quite have as much compost as I wanted. So when I planted potatoes, I got loads of like nettles and dock and all sorts of things that I put at the bottom of the hole, added just a little bit of rock dust and planted the potatoes on there, harvested them, got absolutely amazing results. And another example was deciding to use a broad fork on some of the beds. The second principle is ecosystem emphasis. It's seeing your garden as a whole, like entire ecosystem that relates to everything that's around the outside borders, but you want it to kind of be a home for wildlife, not just a holiday destination. And so instead of like some gardening methods only focus on soil health, I'm thinking about all total garden health. I want to have as many microbes above ground and below ground. I want as many arthropods. I want as many different variants of wildlife to create a very thriving ecosystem. This is because, like in nature, where you have diversity and you have lots of things going on, it is much better at maintaining resilience. And also it's important to remember that whilst soil feed plants, plants also feed the soil. It's a symbiotic relationship. And also I want to do my bit for local insect populations. And so the way of focusing on ecosystem emphasis is by creating habitats for pollinators and other beneficial insects above ground. And the other thing is to use various different microbes or microbial amendments like JMS or LAB from Korean natural farming that can be used either on the soil, or like LAB, it can be used on plants. So you encourage total garden microbial health. A really important factor is that if you do have some pests in your garden, in most cases, it's actually a really good thing, because if there were no pests whatsoever, then there is no reason for the predators to be there. And so that's why I don't like to just obliterate things with chemicals. I like to make sure that there's a nice balance. There's a nice balance where I feel like I will have the insects, my army of beneficial insects to help me wherever possible. In some cases I do need to step in and I might want to remove some affected plants, but it's just thinking about the whole garden health, not just about the soil. Now, focusing just on the soil health element, that is adding carbon into the soil, like mulching that breaks down, adding compost, incorporating cover crops. Carbon is the building block of kind of life as we know it, and so adding that into the soil and building that carbon content through organic matter is very beneficial. The third principle of minimal disturbance gardening is responsible resourcing, and this takes into a few accounts. The first is to, wherever possible, if you have access to local sustainable resources that you can use, it could be things like food waste from a restaurant, or you might have access to seaweed. After a stormy day on the beach, you can pick up some seaweed, or perhaps there's a local bike shop where you can get loads of big bits of cardboard boxes. It's encouraged for you to use those materials. Another example of responsible resourcing is very much an economic one. Not everyone has a budget to be able to just go out and buy organic seeds. In fact, a lot of the seeds that I sow aren't certified organic, even though I am growing them in a very organic way. And so being responsible economically, in tune with your household, is a really important thing to do, and I don't think it's spoken enough about in the gardening world. And again, it's a source of guilt, where people feel like, oh no, I've bought seeds that aren't organic, or I've bought F1 seeds or something. Again, you're growing food that's the most important thing. All these other things are like not the most important thing. It comes back round to only you knowing your garden and your goals and your challenges the best. One challenge that I have in this area is access to bulk compost. If I want a proper bulk compost supplier, it's at least over an hour away, and transport costs alone will be about £200. I can get bulk compost in dumpy bags, but again, it's just everyone's situation is different, and I think it's so important that we account for that. One of my favourite ideas about responsible resourcing is swapping and bartering and exchanging with people in your area, for example, seeds or plants or cuttings. And I really think that there could be so many more ways where gardeners can create more seed swaps, more plant swaps, more just informal things where we can all help one another share excess, share surplus, share cool things, as well as sharing advice such as potential local resources that you can get savvy with and use in your garden. The fourth principle is dynamic crop polyculture. So this is using a wide variety of different planting techniques when practically possible to encourage good diversity and polyculture to create a more productive and resilient garden. So these techniques include things like succession planting, gap planting, intercropping, companion planting, and also not putting all of your eggs in one basket. So that means splitting your staples into more than one location. Maybe it could be 2 or 3 in different corners of the garden, so that there's less chance of a pest or disease just obliterating the entire crop. The dynamic part means that there's always new things going in and other things coming out, and it avoids the idea of ever needing crop rotation, because again, crop rotation doesn't exist in nature. It's effective, especially on a larger scale, but in a garden, you just don't need to worry about it. Instead, you use things like succession planting. So whenever I harvest a crop, I try and grow something new in its place as soon as possible. So behind me I've got winter cabbages, and what was growing before the winter cabbages were my onions. And I'd planted some pak choi in between and also some spring onions, and so there's always just different things growing together. What this dynamic polyculture allows is that it prevents a build-up of pests and diseases, especially in the soil, and it also helps address particular potential nutrient imbalances. And diversity is resilience in nature, so we can apply that to our gardens. Gap plugging is a very easy method of creating a polyculture. That's where if you start harvesting stuff or a gap emerges in one of your raised beds, you just put in a different crop and let that grow, and it's a very nice way of doing it. Another example is corner planting, like planting something that attracts beneficial insects like nasturtiums or borage or calendula on a corner of a raised bed, allow it to kind of like flow over, and it just helps create that nice diversity. What's really important is striking a balance between good polyculture but also pretty easy management, because remember, we are trying to grow food as well, and so it's down to you to realise just how much of a complex polyculture you want to do. For me, the majority of my focus is on succession planting, gap plugging, and then growing a few nice borders for attracting pollinators around the area. And in some cases I'll allow certain plants to run to flower, like some fennel. I'll leave some fennel behind because those are loved by hoverflies and lacewings. And also, one thing I have noticed is that if a garden is pretty packed with plants, I very, very rarely see any kind of pest or disease concern. There might be something slight and tiny, but it's very much focused in one specific area. And so I haven't got any rooted evidence for this, but it is a pattern that I continually see, especially when I visit other gardens that are nice and packed in with lots of things growing. So I find that interesting. And also, going back to my permaculture roots, is very much looking at pattern recognition or observing patterns and then thinking, oh, what's going on here? And looking a little bit under the surface, so to speak. The fifth principle is continuous soil cover. So wherever possible, there shouldn't be bare soil. Again, this is just a target. Sometimes there will be a bit of bare soil for a bit of time, and that's okay. But utilising methods such as succession planting or cover crops or mulching with compost, or even putting something over like cardboard to reduce erosion and reduce exposure to the elements of bare ground over winter, these are all different ways that we can easily protect the soil. Wherever possible, try and look at how you can cover soil where it's going to add fertility, i.e. adding compost or mulches or even cover crops or green manures. But sometimes, as I just mentioned, it's okay to use something that isn't really going to break down or provide much fertility, like cardboard, because you don't have to worry about weeds, and then the following spring you just remove it and you can plant right into it. For me, in this climate, especially the wet climate, the soil is most susceptible to damage and compaction over the winter months, and that's the most likely time that there's not going to be anything growing on the surface, and so that's when I usually take the most precautionary action. My goal is always going to be adding around an inch, 2 to 3 centimeters of compost on each bed, but there are some occasions or some years where I have skipped that for a year, and I've still had really good results. I don't want to skip that for many years, because growing food is a process of extracting nutrients. Whatever you harvest to eat is nutrients that you're taking out of the system, and so you've got to think about how to at least eventually get those nutrients back into the system. But all I want to say is that whilst there is like that target to aim for of adding compost as a layer on the surface every single year, don't worry if you skip a year. There's other ways of working around that. So if I don't have as much compost as I want, it kind of comes back round if I'm wanting to cover the soil, especially over winter, comes back round to that kind of assess before action for anything that I do in the garden. Look at all of the options that are out there and choose which one that I think makes the most amount of sense. And part of what I want is for the principles to all kind of form a bit of a interconnected web where they can all help and support one another. one aspect I'm particularly excited about with the idea of continuous cover and minimal disturbance gardening is utilising a greater array of cover crops and green manures in the garden setup, especially over winter, so I can have living roots in the soil, feeding the soil life, that then I could potentially at the start of spring, especially if I'm still developing beds and they're only 1 or 2 years old, I can cut them and mix them in and then transplant semi-mature seedlings into, and then away they go in a nice bacterially dominated soil that has had far less disturbance than, say, digging in a lot of compost. The other benefit, of course, is covered soil does help reduce weed pressures. If you've got a cover crop growing, then it's far less likely for a weed to take over, and if you've got a physical barrier like cardboard, then weeds aren't going to be growing there. Those are the 5 principles, which we're going to recap soon, very soon, but there's 2 kind of attitudes or mindsets that I think are also beneficial, that work hand in hand with minimal disturbance gardening. The first one is be observant, because if you're being observant, you're watching what's happening. Observation, it harvests information, and with information and experience, that brings knowledge. If you are new to gardening, there are probably going to be times where you might make the wrong decision if you're looking back in hindsight, but all you're going to be doing is building up your knowledge, so you get to a stage where most of the decision making that you make is very intuitive. It's just a skill, it's just a practice, it's not something that you just get straight away, but it's something that builds on top of each other as time progresses. So be observant, always just have a little look at what's going on in your garden, look from different angles, but also observe things that kind of stand out to you, that make you think, and it leads on to the second attitude of just be curious, because that is my biggest driver in the garden. I'm curious about trying different techniques, about trying different varieties, about trying to grow different flavours, and if you align your gardening with your curiosity, it's going to be a lot more kind of fun and satisfying, because you've got another reason or another goal behind your growing that will help keep you on track. So to recap, I've come up with an easy acronym to remember, which is to recap. The 2 stands for the 2 different attitudes. R is for responsible resourcing, E is for ecosystem emphasis, C is for continuous soil cover, A is for assess before action, and P stands for polyculture in the form of dynamic crop polyculture. I have a few thoughts for you moving forward from here. So if you're starting out and if you're a new gardener, pick 1 or 2 of the principles that might stand out most to you or excite you the most. It's the same that I say if someone's new to permaculture. There might be one particular principle that, I don't know, you just hear it and you think, that's interesting. Well, follow that interest, follow that curiosity, and then you can you'll see naturally how everything else starts to incorporate and work together as a team. It's very much teamwork, gardening and permaculture. The other element is that because this is annual focused, one of the probably the most important thing is compost production. So I always have a priority on always trying to, as an optimum, have access to compost, but to understand that sometimes can't always do that. But I love to use different growing techniques where I can make compost but also have other benefits at the same time, like a hotbed. And you might be in a rural area and there might be a local organic farm or a natural farm where you can get access to well broken down animal manure, be it cow or horse manure, that you can also use in your garden, that you can use instead of worrying about trying to create loads of compost. It's kind of being reactive to what is there available to you in your location and tailoring your garden and your goals around that. A really good habit is to just question things. Try not to always just fall into the trap of following the crowd. The final thing for me to say is that it's just about having good, honest gardening that is very practical, logical, reasonable, and a lot of fun. That's very much the theory of minimal disturbance gardening covered, and over the coming months we'll be sharing a lot of different practical videos related around it. In my upcoming book, The Self-Sufficiency Garden, that's available to pre-order, I've included information about minimal disturbance gardening approaches there, as well as tips and recommendations if you've just got a blank slate, how to start to convert that into a very productive garden that could average you around 100 portions of food per square metre. So yeah, check it out, and I'll see you again soon.